forgot. Please, come in. Yes. Now we're gonna נשמע עכשיו את ההרצאה הרביעית שתינתן באנגלית, וזאת הסיבה שמינה לא הצטרפה לשולחן קודם, כי עזרו לה להבין את ההרצאות הקודמות בעברית. אז ההרצאה הבאה היא באנגלית, והיא באמת על השתתפות על הפער המגדרי בקרב פלסטינים. Please, 15 minutes, and
Okay.
we'll say in Hebrew 5 and 2.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I don't actually have a presentation. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to talk a bit about the voting gender gap in Palestine. Before I start, I'd just like to apologise. I only started my MPhil 2 weeks ago, and I haven't been able to access the raw data for the polls that I'm referring to, so I'm looking at what's been published online. So I can't give any definitive answers or explanations. I'm just going to hint at my ideas so far. So, is there a voting gender gap in Palestine? I can't say for sure. Elections aren't exactly regular. But there seems to be a gender gap in support for political parties. Polls vary slightly, but show two persistent trends indicating a gender gap in political preferences between women and men. Women seem to support Fatah less than men, and Hamas more. I'm going to describe these trends and then propose 4 possible explanations for this gender gap. The first trend is that women seem to be less likely to vote for Fatah than men. Looking at the Palestinian Center for Policy and Social Research polls since 2011, there's been a difference between male and female support for Fatah and Abbas, ranging from 0.4 to 9%. It's also not just a problem with current Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas, but also with the Fatah contender Marwan Barghouti. They are both less popular with women than men. The second trend is that women seem to be more likely to vote for Hamas than men. According to the PCPSR polls again, going back to 2011, there is a difference in support for Hamas among women and men of 0.4 to 5%, while support for Ismail Haniyeh has been even more divisive, with women being more in favour of Haniyeh by 14% in a 2012 poll. These two trends seem particularly odd to feminists in the West, who see Hamas as a violent extremist organisation which represses women, and Fatah as a more left-wing, peace-seeking organisation. Why would women more than men support Hamas and not Fatah? Referring to recent polls, the gender gap literature, and the interviews I conducted in and around Nablus this summer, I have at this stage come up with 4 potential explanations. First, that in Palestine, women are more violently nationalist than men. Second, that women are more religious than men. Third, that Hamas provides services or care that Fatah does not. And finally, that employment, patronage, and corruption impact men and women differently and how they vote. I'll now take each of these possible explanations and describe what evidence there is to support them. First, might women be more violently nationalist than men in Palestine? This might explain why women would support Hamas more than Fatah. Hamas continues to pursue armed resistance against Israel with the aim of ending the occupation and achieving a Palestinian state, while the Fatah leadership has become synonymous with the peace process and has rejected violent methods. Could it be that women, more than men, prefer this method of violent resistance? The feminist literature is divided on the question of women and violence. Some argue that women are inherently more peaceful than men. One writer, Sarah Ruddick, thinks that the experience of motherhood is a natural resource for peace politics. There are also numerous peace organisations, such as the Women in Black, who link womanhood with peace. Polls in the US show that in most cases, women are more peace-seeking than men. Barbara Noranda has shown that women tend to be much less likely to support use of force issues in policing, capital punishment, but also in foreign policy. On the other hand, many feminist authors fight the stereotype of women as non-violent. They've shown how violent women exist as murderers, terrorists, and soldiers. They believe that women are just as capable of war, violence, and cruelty as men. There seems to be a recurring theme of female violence in defense of their family, their children, and particularly in the context of ethno-nationalist conflict. Sarah Ruddick writes that mothers work with life-gripping passion on behalf of particular children and kin. Often they are fiercely committed to the values and survival of their people. It is not surprising that mothers who practice non-violence at home nonetheless sometimes teach their children to hate all the people their relatives hate. Political or religious allegiance, fear of the different stranger, misguided desire for purity or order, and the sheer lust to see one's own children privileged, all may fuel a violence towards outsiders. Research from the United States shows that in the wake of the September 11th attacks, women temporarily became more right-wing than men on issues such as increasing the defense budget. It is certainly possible that within the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, Palestinian women might adopt a more violent position than men. My interviews in Nablus did not support an idea of a gender difference towards violence, but perhaps a generational one. The young people I interviewed supported armed resistance and the destruction of Israel, while the older generations supported a more pragmatic approach and a two-state or a democratic one-state solution, including Hamas supporters. Motherhood does seem to impact slightly on women's choices, but it's unclear how this might influence their votes. The two mothers I spoke to expressed serious concern for the security of their families and of their homes, while they also suggested that Fatah was ineffective at stopping the IDF and settlers from attacking them. They did not point to Hamas's violent tactics as preferable for the safety of their families. Polling data from the PCPSR seems to show that actually women in Palestine are less violently nationalist than men. Women have consistently over the past few years been less supportive of armed resistance and more in favour of peace and negotiations than men. The latest poll this October shows that 39% of women supported armed resistance as the best method of ending their occupation, compared to 48% of men. This, combined with my interviews, seems to rule out the idea of women supporting Hamas over Fatah because of female support for their violent tactics. Perhaps then, women support Hamas more and Fatah less because women are more religious than men. Hamas is clearly an Islamist party, while Fatah is not. If women are not voting for them because of their support of armed resistance, then it's likely that Hamas's religious identity appeals to women more than men. The idea of increased religiosity among women is familiar in voting gender gap literature. Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, in their book Rising Tide, wrote that women are more religious than men in less developed societies. They point to a lack of economic or physical security and few opportunities for education as factors which are linked to women being more conservative than men. In Palestine, although education is incredibly good compared with other Arab states, there is clearly little economic or physical security. Norris and Inglehart write that societies whose people live with high levels of insecurity tend to develop cultures mistrustful of rapid change, emphasizing the values of traditional authority and strong leadership, inherited social status, and norms derived from religious authorities. In these societies, the traditional two-parent family with its division of sex roles between male breadwinner and female caregiver is crucial for the survival of children. Women in these circumstances have less opportunity to work and are more greatly tied to the home and the family. They tend to be more religious and conservative than men and vote accordingly. In the interviews that I conducted this summer, they seem to suggest that this might be the case. Most of those I interviewed suggested that more women than men might vote for Hamas because women are more religious. There seems to me to be a likely factor in why women might support Hamas. At this stage, I haven't been able to access any statistics to confirm or deny the difference in religiosity, but I know there are several projects which are looking into this, such as the Arab Barometer. But even if there is a difference in levels of religiosity, how and why women are more religious remains unclear. 3 interviewees suggested women are more emotional. Others suggest that women spend more time alone at home, so have more time to pray and think about religion. One suggested that women are more religious because Islam is better for women in terms of equality than traditional Arab practices. An interviewee told me, tradition makes it so that if a man finds his sister and she is only talking with a boy, he will kill her, while Islam says that you have to punish her but not to kill her. Although this might still seem pretty bad to us, it's clearly an improvement. There are certain feminist themes in Islam which portray it as a liberating religion which benefits women's rights. and it has just been misinterpreted by men. However, none of those I interviewed supported Hamas for feminist reasons, and many were aware and afraid about their treatment of women in Gaza. One interviewee thought that Hamas forcing women to wear the hijab, although she wore it herself, was unacceptable. She told me, "If you want to wear hijab, and if you don't, it's not a big deal. I cannot force you to do something. It is a matter between you and God. This is something I hate. I feel that if they force me to wear hijab and I don't want to, I may take it off, even though I know that this is something that God wants me to do. Maybe I would take it off and tell them that they cannot control me." Yet despite this, she still identified with Hamas as a party because she said she loves God and she wanted to vote for a religious party. So it's clear there's a link between religiosity and support for Hamas. Third, I looked at whether there's a difference in provision of welfare or services between the two parties. There's been a great deal...
2 more minutes?
Okay. I'll try. There's been a great deal written about Hamas's link to the charitable and welfare sector by Matthew Levitt and Sarah Roy. The female vote, as we've discussed, has been very much linked to this provision of welfare and services. Women tend to vote to the left. Sorry, skipping a bit. And in Palestine, women are much more economically vulnerable. They're more often carers. According to the UN, women's unemployment has doubled in the last 10 years, while men's unemployment levels has reduced. So better services would benefit women more than men. And can't at this stage say statistically that women's lesser economic status leads to their support for Hamas. But in my interviews in this summer, only one woman I spoke to who had 2 disabled children said that services provision was actually a voting priority for her. One girl seemed to kind of summarize everyone else's attitudes to services and welfare when she said, "Yeah, here I guess you have bigger issues." And the fourth, finally, might employment and corruption mean that women are less likely to vote for Fatah than men? This final factor is not considered in much detail in the gender gap literature, but in Palestine, neo-patrimonialism and corruption are particularly prominent. By this I mean that jobs tend to be distributed through favoritism called wasta, and the government, the Palestinian Authority, either directly or indirectly, is the major source of employment. Men in Palestine are usually the primary breadwinners, and jobs are scarce. As such, men in employment might have an economic interest in the status quo. In a non-meritocratic system, a change in ruling party may mean a loss of job security, whereas women, who tend to be poorer and less likely to have a job than men, might not have such a direct economic interest in the status quo. Instead, they might feel resentment at the corruption and the need for wasta or contacts to get ahead. As such, they might support an opposing party and one which isn't part of the current system. Everyone I spoke to said that wasta and corruption was a big issue for them, but I couldn't discern any particular gender bias, apart from the 2 people I spoke to who are unemployed said it was a priority for them, and they happen to be women. Again, there's no direct evidence for this, but what was interesting is when you break down the support for Hamas and Fatah by region, women in Gaza support Fatah more than men, and they support Hamas less than men, and women in the West Bank support Hamas more than men and Fatah less than men, which seems to say that they're voting against the status quo. So just to sum up, although on this we see these trends of varying size, when you break it down, it actually seems less shocking. Although on the surface, it may seem counterintuitive, it looks likely that women who support Hamas do not do so out of violence, but because Hamas seem more moral, fitting in with their women's increased religiosity, and less corrupt than Fatah. Additionally, in the West Bank, at least, a vote for Hamas is a vote for change. That women in Gaza and the West Bank both vote against the status quo is hardly surprising when you consider the double difficulties faced by women in Palestine from the occupation and from the patriarchal society. Thank you.
Thank you.